Hey everybody, welcome back to part 3. Little bit of change in the plan. I ended up filming all of the construction and the video was just ridiculously long. It ended up being about 2.5 hours, so I just decided to save you guys the boredom of watching me snap this kit together and basically have just fully assembled the model. As you can see here, got all this done. Arms are done. The shield, and the beam rifle. Like I said, the video just got really long, and I didn't think you guys would want to sit and just watch me snapping it up. Basically, parts 1 and 2, putting the foot together, it's the same process through the whole kit. Just follow the instructions, and it's really very simple. But and as you can see, these are just kind of loosely fit. That way we can take it all back apart for the, the painting and all that stuff. In the future, if there are parts that you all want to see, let me know. Let me know in the comments, and I'll try to do shorter videos just for those specific things. But like I said, I couldn't upload a 2.5 hour video just of me snapping the kit together. That's boring. I wouldn't want to sit and watch it. And now we can move on to the more interesting stuff, the fun stuff, the customizing and all that. So as far as the plan goes for how we're going to paint this thing and all this stuff, we're going to basically use the same colors. I'll be using Tamiya paints, not necessarily this color, but I really like the Tamiya paints. They're easy to spray, they're easy to brush. If you thin them a little bit, they brush on really smooth. So that's what we'll be using. And like I said, we're going to follow the basic color scheme. Blue for blue, red for red, yellow for yellow, all that stuff. We are going to do some pre-shading. I'll go over that a little more when we get to it. That'll come after the priming and all that stuff. In terms of lighting, we're going to try to light these vents. We're going to try to light the eyes. I'd like to light one of the beam sabers, so he'll have one beam saber in his backpack and the other one in his hand, and that'll be lit. We'll show you how to do all that. So yeah, that's what's going to happen going forward. Give me just a second, and we'll jump into some seam line work. There are some really nasty seam lines here and there on this kit, mostly on the arms and legs. Where's my, there we go, right here on the foot. We're going to fill this seam, we're going to fill this seam, and this monster that runs all the way down the back of the leg. So but it'll be pretty simple to do. Let's see. All just comes apart, and so we'll be able to fill this one in as it is, and then just paint it all as one unit. And we'll go into that. There'll be a little bit of modification on the foot. I want to be able to remove the ankle, fill the seam, paint everything, and then be able to reassemble it. So I'll show you how we do that. It's tricky, but it's not as complicated as you might think. So other seams that will need to be dealt with: the arm. Both sides of the arm has a nasty old seam. We're going to fill that. And I'm also going to show you how to cover these. These ports are for if you want the shield connected to the arm, right? You can plug that in, right? We will want that on one of the arms, but I don't think I want it on both of the arms. As you can see, both arms. That way you can choose which arm. I don't really think I want it on both arms. So we're gonna pick which arm we want the shield on, and then I'll show you how to cover that up so that you don't see the hole. The upper arms are just like the legs. I don't know if I showed you guys that, but the legs, they actually made the seam to mirror the panel line, so you don't have to worry about filling that. That'll be invisible. Same with the arms. There's a little seam here, but as you can see, it kind of looks like a panel line. Can you see that? So I'm not going to worry with that. The shoulder, I'm not entirely sure what I'm going to do with that yet. The problem, let me just take this part. The problem is if I fill this seam, make this one piece, then the shoulder will be trapped, right? And honestly, I really don't think I'll be able to paint inside here and of course inside the shoulder with this in place. So I think I may just live with that seam. I'm hoping maybe once it's painted it will not be quite so obvious. I don't know, it's pretty ugly. You'll never see this because that'll be up against the body, right? So you'll never really see the inside, but that top seam it's pretty ugly. But if I can figure out a good way to do it where we can, you know, have this part out, fill this, right, and then be able to put this in after. I mean, as you can see, it's it's not going to fit in there the way, you know, the way it should. So if I can figure out a good way to do that, of course I'll go over it with you guys, but for right now, I think the plan is just to leave this seam as it is. Maybe I don't know, maybe we can put a decal or something. I don't know. We'll figure that out later. That's going to be a headache. As far as the body goes, there's no real ugly seam lines. We could do the torso here, and we may just do that, just because, you know, it doesn't really look like it should split, right? So we'll probably fill that. Again, it's watch out for that. Again, it's just a matter of being able to fill this seam and then still assemble everything, which shouldn't be a problem here. Everything just snaps in, as you can see. So we'll probably fill this seam. For the chest, I haven't decided. Here again, I haven't decided if I can live with that. Basically, it's just this top seam, right? But it almost looks like panel lines. So I don't know. We'll see. I don't know if I'll do that. We'll see. The waist piece has basically no seams. You can go in and fill the, you know, the inner armor part if you want to, but honestly, you're never going to really see it. So I typically don't do that. What other seams do we have? The backpack doesn't really have any seams at all, so that's nice. That can just be painted. The beam rifle has a monster that goes literally all the way across, right? All the way around. So that'll need filling, and that'll take a little doing. One thing to be careful when you're gluing your beam rifle, and we'll go over this a little bit more. These moving parts, if you get glue down in the hinge, right? Well, those aren't going to be moving parts anymore. So be really, really careful when you're gluing in here, because these will seize up. Now you can't always just do like fixed pose where, you know, these are just like that, right? You can glue this in place, you can glue that in place, and it'll just be fixed. There's nothing wrong with that. I very rarely, you know, when these things are on display, I very rarely move these. So, you know, if you want it fixed pose, that's always something you can do. This part is just loosely put in place because we're going to paint that separately. But largely the beam rifle will get painted all as one unit. Yeah, so alright, so that's the plan going forward. The head seam, that is going to be This is going to be a monster, and I'll tell you why. The entire head basically is the face rather is all assembled inside. Let me see if I can get this apart. Hang on a second. Hold, please. Oh, come on now. Ah, there we go. All right, so this part won't be an issue. We can paint that little bit after the fact. As a matter of fact, I'll probably end up just gluing that in place, and we'll paint all that together. The problem with the head, and if I can get this to pop out, there we go. See, the entire face goes in as one unit, right? Well, if we put the head together and fill that seam, right, there's not going to be any way to get that back in place. So I'll have to do a little head scratching and see what we can do to make that possible. Be able to put the face in after everything's painted, after these, you know. And honestly, on the head, I'm not too bothered by this seam line, because that looks like, you know, this is the front panel of this section. So that just looks like a different panel. This seam is really ugly, right? It goes all the way over the top of the head. This fin should be all one piece, right? There shouldn't be a seam here. And then same on this side, you know, that looks like a panel. So I'm pretty cool with that. All of this needs to be filled. You know, that will be ugly. So let me work out how we're going to be able to do that. And like I said, we'll go over that in the video. So yeah, for right now, we don't know yet. We'll figure it out. But that's the fun. All right, so give me just a couple of minutes and get all this stuff cleaned up, and we will start with seam lining. We'll start with the foot because there's going to be some modifications here, and I'll want to go over that with you. But we'll start with that, and hopefully get that done, get a leg done, maybe the beam saver. It depends on how long this thing goes. If it ends up being super long, we'll probably cut out some of them. But if you can fill one seam, you can fill all the seams. It's the exact same process for the beam rifle as it is for, you know, the shin. So we'll go over some of that. So give me just a second, get all this stuff cleaned up, and we will get on with seam lining. All right, welcome back, everybody. Time to start doing some seam lines. I've already done this foot. As you can see, there are no pesky seams across the front. And this one we're going to do. So how did we get rid of those seams? Well, like I told you, there is some modification to the foot that needs to be done in order to do this. Now, the ankle guard is one of the first ones. In order for this to be seam lined, if I just pop it off, we want to be able to paint this separately, because if it's covering all of this, we'll never paint that. So what did we do? We filled this seam line, and then I reinforced the back. This is just a, I don't know if you guys can make that out. This is just a piece of sprue, right, that I glued in place just to give a little extra strength in this joint, because you are going to have to be able to just ever so slightly open that up to install it. So we'll show you how to do that. As far as the foot goes, there's a bit of modification in order to be able to take this ankle out, right? So we can paint all this separately from the foot. We've modded the bottom, right? So that now that ankle will pop out through the bottom of the foot. And now we can paint this separately from that. Now, how did we do this? Well, that's what we're going to start with today. All right, so let's disassemble this foot. Like I said, none of these seams have been filled, so you can just break this ankle armor off. Don't break it off. Remove the ankle armor. Right, disassemble. Get all this out of the way. Disassemble this foot. and get the ankle out. Right. So here is the foot as we want it to be. Right, when we're done, we want this to be all one piece. Right. So as you can see, there's a whole lot of chopping that goes on underneath, and to do that, the first thing you need to do is, I don't know if you can make it out on camera, but there's a little lip right here, right? It sticks out just beyond the inside of the foot. So that's the first thing we're going to remove. To do that, just get your nippers, and what I normally do is just cut it off right where it lines up with the rest of the foot, and then cut it off right. Now when you're doing this, it may feel, oh, look out below, it may feel a little bit, just savage to be hacking away at your model like this, but remember, this is the bottom of the foot, okay? So it's going to be inside here, right? You're never going to see any of this stuff that we're modding. The one place you want to be careful, well, let's finish this up first. So the other side, do the same thing, right where it meets the rest of the foot, and then cut across, right, just like that. So we end up with no more lip. All right. The next part is cutting out that joint. Now when this goes in, right, this is going to go in like this, right, and you can see that it hits both of these lips, right? So we need to get rid of that, and the way we do that, you don't want to mess up this edge, okay? That's important, because that's going to be flush with the foot, right, when you put it all together. So the first thing I do is take your blade, take your razor, your hobby knife, or whatever you have, and I don't know if you can see it. Let me zoom in here a little bit. Can you see that? Hello? Focus? There's a little notch right here. Well, what I'll do is just score across where that notch is. Here, I'll try to do it on camera so you guys can see what I'm doing. So right where that notch is, just make a little score mark, right across to about there. All right, now all that does is just span the joint. All right, do the same thing on the other side. Just score it. Now what's going to happen is when we start snapping this plastic, it'll break at the score mark, and it will not damage the rest of the part, hopefully. Right? Okay, let's take this back apart. It's easier to work with in pieces. I just had it together so you guys can see. So then we're gonna snip it. I don't know if you can make out where that score mark is. Maybe you can. We're gonna snip it right at the end of that score mark, and then right on this bend where the plastic bends, right up to the score mark. Right? Now we can take that piece that we scored and break it right out. See that? Same on this side. Break it right off. Now we have access to this joint, right? So same thing on the other foot. We've already scored this one, so I'm just going to make a cut right to the score mark and right on the corner of the plastic, and break that right out. Remember guys, you're never going to see any of this stuff under here. This is all going to be hidden, right? Alright, so we have that. Now where the ankle hits the joint, right, it's going to have to go through there. So what we do is cut our joint right there and right there. Right now, the little poly cap. Oops, God, I got butterfingers today. The little poly cap, we're just gonna take that whole section out, right? Just like that. Make sure these edges are nice and straight. You don't want anything getting in the way when you try to install the ankle. And I tend to cut them back kind of at a 45, so that, you know, if you look at the ankle, you know, that's just about wide enough. You guys make that out? That's just about wide enough for that to pop in, boop, just like that. I think I'm going to widen it just a little bit. Well, you know, first let's do the foot. Which one? This is the one we cut. Alright, so we've already cut through the plastic. Now it's just a matter of breaking out that section that we cut, which will just break out. If you just use your nippers, you can just break it out in pieces. Ideally, what you want to do is, once you've cut it out, take your blade and just kind of clean it up so there's no little corners to grab onto when you put the ankle in. Just kind of smooth it out a little bit. Like I said, none of this is going to be visible, so don't worry about that. And as you can see, that ankle, well, if it was right way around, that ankle now slots right through, right? I think I'm going to make it just a bit wider. It's not quite wide enough, so just take off another, I don't know, another millimeter or so, right? Now the ankle will slot through, right? So if we put our poly cap back in, we can see that the poly cap is still a bit wider than the joint. So if we take our nippers and just knock off that little bit of extra poly cap, right, now we have a slot. Same thing on this side. Just make sure it's nice and flush. The poly cap will get in the way a little bit sometimes if it's not super flush. So same thing on this side. We need it wide enough for the foot to get into, and you can use this as a reference. You know, we cut it back pretty much to this little notch, so we'll do the same thing on this side. We'll come up to that notch and just cut right through. And then how far did we go back on this side? Do the same thing. We can cut it off, and we can always adjust it, but we can cut it off right there and pop out the poly cap. Again, that little section will just pop out. Don't worry about that. Clean up these edges just a little bit, make them nice and straight. And again, I like to cut it back at a kind of a 45-degree angle so that it's not in the way at all. I hope you guys can see what I'm doing here. It's kind of tiny, but anyway, just make sure it's nice and flat, nice and smooth. There's no edges. Same thing on the foot. We've already made our cuts, so now we can just pop that section out, right? And I can already see that's not anywhere near wide enough. If you see the other side, so we're gonna have to widen that a little bit. One way to do that is just hold your foot up, right? And you can see that this side is still a little bit. Oops! Watch your eyes, guys. Take our blade and just kind of tidy that up a little bit. Make sure there's no edges to grab onto when we go to install the foot. That looks pretty good. Poly cap. We'll put the poly cap back in. And we've got a little bit of overhang on this side, so we'll just nip that off. And I think that looks pretty good. So now we test it. Put the foot back together. All right, we've got our modification. Take our ankle piece, and now we should be able to, whoops, maybe if we put the foot together properly. Alright, now, foot's together. Now we've got our ankle piece, which will slot in thusly, and should snap right into place. And it does not. So, what do we need to do? We need to make our slots ever so slightly wider. We can come in and just take off another little slice. Do this a little bit at a time, everybody, because you know it's real easy to go and cut too much, and then your joint will be loose. If you do this properly, your joint will still be nice and tight. It will still function correctly, and there won't be any kind of wiggle to your joint, or you know it'll feel just like it should if you had never modded it. So just do a little bit at a time. There we go. And I think this poly cap was kind of hindering us, so we're going to just trim that a little bit. Alright, so a little bit at a time. Just take off tiny little bits and test it again. Foot slots in just like that. And see, as you can see, we still got full motion. It's not loose. It's not wobbly at all. The poly cap still functions just like it's supposed to. And with just a couple little simple mods, now we can pop the ankle out, or we can break the whole foot. We can pop the ankle out, fill these seam lines, and paint everything separately. Like I said, it's going to feel a little extreme when you start cutting away, but you know, don't worry. The more you mess with it and play with it, you'll see that there's a lot of stuff you can do to these kits that you know you'll never see in the end. So we've got our modification. Now how do we fill the seam line? Easy. What I like to do is just open the seam ever so slightly, right? And the glue I prefer to use is Tamiya Extra Thin. This is a wonderful welding cement. It will actually melt the plastic and fuse the two pieces together. It sands really easy. It paints really easy. So this is what we end up using. So we'll get a little glue on our brush. Like I said, have a tiny little gap between the two pieces. Not super huge, but enough to where glue can get in there. This stuff is so thin that it will seep in between cracks, right? So we get a little glue and run it right down the seam. Let the brush kind of go in between the parts, and be pretty liberal with this stuff, guys. I mean, you're gonna sand away anything that you know that blobs over. So get a nice little bit of glue. Don't forget the back. Right down between the parts, just like that. And I also put some on the bottom. You're never going to see the seam, but it will help to hold the part together. So just right on these little blocks. These will fit into the bottom of the foot. I just put a little dab just to give it some extra strength. Alright, maybe one more little coat across the top. Now once this glue touches the plastic, like I said, it starts melting the plastic. It's a welding cement. So when we push it together, hopefully you'll see there'll be a little ridge of plastic. Give it a good squeeze all the way across. And I don't know if you can see it, but there's a little blob that squeezes out between the parts. that is the melted plastic squeezing up to the surface. I'm going to give it another little blob right on top just to make sure. You want to see that, guys, because that means the seam is completely filled and the excess plastic is actually squeezing out from between the parts. Now when we sand it, it will, it'll be flush. That ridge will disappear. So that is one seam line taken care of. We'll just set that to the side, give it, half hour or so to dry. The Tamiya glue really dries pretty quickly, but before we start sanding, we want to make sure it's fully cured, of course. So we'll set that to the side, let it dry. For the ankle armor, this was the other bit that we were going to take care of. We want that to be one piece, just like this one, right? Same exact process. You get a little glue, run it right between the seam, and as soon as the glue touches this plastic, it'll start melting the plastic. But be pretty liberal. Like I said, we're going to sand away anything that we don't want. So make sure you get a lot of glue in your seam. Right, just like that. And same thing, we're going to give it a good push together. Hopefully see that little blob of plastic, which that you can actually see that a lot better on this part than the other one. See that little blob? That is perfect. When we sand this seam, it will sand away that extra plastic and it'll just be perfectly smooth. Can you guys see that? That little blob? That's actually what you want. So we'll give that a good smooch together. And that part is now seam lined. We'll still have to sand all this, and we'll come back and do some of that. The other thing we did here was reinforce inside here. Let me grab the other one. Again, we're going to be flexing this part after we paint it and to install it. So we want to reinforce that joint. What I did, let me grab, there we go. This is just a piece of old sprue. Remember in one of the other parts I said hang on to this stuff because it's useful. Here's one of the uses. I just cut off a tiny little bit and you cut it to fit down. Well, it's a little bit fiddly. There you go. Cut it to fit. Oh, got a finger. Cut it to fit down inside. Well, good gracious. Alright, tools. That's what separates us from the animals, people. Use of tools. Cut it to fit down inside, just like that. You're never going to see, well, unless you're looking in here, you'll never see this. So it doesn't have to be perfect, doesn't have to be pretty. It's all going to get painted. It's all going to be, in the end, it's all going to be finished. So take a little bit of our glue and just run it right along. Hope you guys can see what I'm doing here. Run it right along those edges, right? Down inside, all along the bottom. And that's just going to hold that part in place to give a little extra strength to this. Now, one thing I did do, you can also get Tamiya regular cement, which this is the exact same thing, only it's thick, it's gloopy. It's that's really, really thin. It'll seep in between cracks and parts and really just get in there really good. This is a little thicker. It's still a great cement, still a welding cement, but it is thicker, which means wherever you put it is where it's going to be. Now what I'm using this for is on this side, there's not, it's basically in contact on this side, so you can glue it right to it. but I want to make sure there's a good strong hold on this side. Right, so I'm just going to glop a little in there and let it dry, and we should have a nice strong bond when it's all said and done. So I'm going to let this dry, and we will come right back and do some sanding, show you how to finish all this up. Back in a minute. Alright, welcome back everybody. It's been about a day, and now our glue is nice and cured. Both of the pieces that we did look good. Just got to get them cleaned up. Off camera, I did do some of the other seams. The legs have now been filled. The arms. For the most part, everything's filled. So what's next? We are going to clean up the seam lines that we filled. I'm going to show you how to do that really quickly. It's not hard. All you need is a couple of sanding tools and a little patience. So initially, I showed you guys previously sanding sticks. Those are spectacular. Those are great to use. For the initial run, I grabbed just some like standard sandpaper. This is a 220 grit, which in terms of plastic modeling is ultra coarse. All right, some of these are, I mean, they're in the thousands. So when you're using this stuff, it works great. All right, especially for the glue, because this is a hard thing to sand. It's not as easy as the plastic. When you're using coarse grit sandpaper, just be really careful on your edges, anywhere that there's a line, because this will eat away material really quickly. So, got our sandpaper, and initially we're just going to go in and knock off just the, I don't know if you can make it out, but there's like a blob right on the top. We're just going to knock that down with the coarse sandpaper. Again, be really careful around your edges and your details, because this stuff will just eat it up. But this is the initial sand, just to get rid of that blob on top. As you can see, it makes pretty short work of that glue. Hope you guys can see all this. Just give it a really good sand. Like I said, this is the initial sand. We're going to do several steps after this, but this will just get the surface level. Especially on little panels like this, be extra careful. You don't want to eat up your detail. You just want to sand away that glue mark. Same on these little panels here. Be really, really careful not to mess up your details. But just for the initial sand, I like to get a really, really coarse piece. It knocks down that glue a whole lot faster than, I mean, you can do it with these. You know, I've got a coarse, and you know, that will certainly knock it down. Will it be as fast? No. Will it do as good a job? Absolutely. You know, and really these are great for some of the smaller details. You know, they're nice and rigid. The problem with this is it's not very rigid, right? So if you've got sticks, you know, you can really bear down on them and they won't lose their shape, right? So I do use these. They're a great tool. I just find that the 220 will knock it down much faster, and then you can go back and fine tune it with your sticks, or you know, the pad I showed you earlier. I use this a lot. But for that initial sand, well, here, we'll do this one, and I'll just use the stick. All right, you saw how quickly that 220 knocked it down. That right there is an initial sand. Now you can still see a line, but that's just the glue in the seam. Okay, that will disappear when you paint. If you run your thumb across or your finger across, you know, it feels smooth, but you still see the seam. So on this back side, we'll just use the sanding stick, and you'll see that it works just as well. It just might take a little more elbow grease to get that glue knocked down. Again, be real careful of your details, right? But yeah, you can see it just in this little bit. It's already kind of knocked that surface down. So yeah, they work great. Sponges, sticks, whatever you've got will work. Just might take a little more effort. Might take a little more time. Getting in these little spaces is tricky. And this is one place that the sanding stick does come in handy because it's got a nice right angle, right? So you can get right up against the groove and sand and not worry too much about damaging your details. So that actually looks pretty good. And again, if you feel, you know, you might feel a little bit of an edge, but like I said, this is just the initial sand. So now I'm going to grab my sponge. I love these sponges. I don't know if I mentioned how much I love them, but you know, they've got different coarseness built right into the sponge. So, you know, you're not fiddling around looking for another stick or looking for a different tool. Everything's right here. So the first sand is the coarsest side. The coarsest? Is that a word? I don't know if that's a word. Just really, really gently on these details, everybody. You don't want to lose any of that detail. But as you can see, just in that little bit of time, we've got this part pretty well ready for paint. I do feel a slight little edge right on the end, so I'm going to go back with my coarse and just sand this side because it feels like that side's a little bit high. So we'll just knock that down a little teeny bit and go back to our sponge. And all the sponge does is you're stepping down in your grit. Very coarse, less coarse, less coarse, less coarse, right? So what you're doing is removing scratches from the plastic. You want a nice smooth surface when you start painting. And that feels pretty good. As far as inside, where's my stick? Let me get my pointer, excuse me. As far as inside here, you know, of course glue gets in there. What I'll typically do is take my coarse grit and just fold a little teeny corner, and that is enough to get in and just kind of knock down the glue that seeped in between. Again, be very careful because you don't want to go too far and destroy that detail. But you can get in there and just give it a really light sand just to get the little blobs out of the groove. And you'll be able to feel it when you're sanding if there's still a ridge there. So there we go. I think that's pretty well got it. One thing I will mention. Oh, we didn't do this backside. One thing I will mention. You know, it might look and feel like you've got it when you're sanding, and you might say, yeah, oh yeah, that's, you know, that seems perfect. But then when you go to prime, primer shows everything. So until you prime it, you're not really going to know for sure if it's exactly the way you want it, right? So once you prime, there may be some going back and excuse me, going back and just, you know, fine tuning it a little bit. And we'll talk about that more after we get the priming done. So just rough up where we sanded. Now I'm going to switch to a lighter grit and just lightly go back over everything we've done. This is just to remove scratches. As far as we're concerned, the seam is filled. It's just to smooth out the plastic. You know, your primer will hide a lot of scratches if you've got a decent primer. But you still want to remove as many of them as you can. Just make the surface as smooth as possible. Now I'm going to go down to the lightest grit and just give it a really, really quick once over. This again will just remove scratches, polish up the plastic. Now let me see if I can get the light to see. Now that piece has, I mean, there's still small scratches, but nothing too major. Again, you'll feel the slightest of grooves. If you do, just go back and hit it again. And you're basically, if you can feel it, you'll see it, right? Once you prime, if you can feel a bump, you're going to see that bump when you prime it. So hit it again, and again, just step it down to remove some scratches, and that feels pretty good. Yep, I like that. So that part's done, ready for paint. Seam lines are filled. The other part we did was the ankle guard, and this one, same thing. I start with the coarse grit. This is just to knock off that surface glue, that blob. Again, being real careful not to sand your edges. It will knock them down. And I like to go different directions. Go side to side first, then go up and down. The scratches will not all be going the same direction, and you'll end up just putting big gouges. If you constantly go side to side, you'll end up with deep gouges going side to side. So give this a quick sand just to show you how we clean up that glue. It's really it's time consuming a little bit, but it's not a very hard process. And the finished product, when you don't have seams everywhere, you don't have, you know, a part that is supposed to be a single piece is obviously two pieces. It just adds to the finished product, I think. Now you don't have to do this, of course. You know, a lot of people don't do this. A lot of people build it right out of the box, and that's fine. That's fine if that's, you know, there's nothing wrong with that at all. As long as you're having fun doing it, you know, that's the key with Gunpla. As long as you're enjoying yourself, you know, do whatever you want to do. That's the beauty of these kits. So that's the initial sand. As you can see, looks like all one piece. Now we're just going to step down with our sponge, remove some of those big scratches. This is the coarse side to start. Like I said, all this is doing is removing scratches. It will remove a little bit of material, but not, you know, it's not gonna dig in like the paper will, right? All this is doing is removing scratches. And we'll go down to the next coarseness. Just, again, all we're doing is polishing the plastic at this point. This is just to smooth everything out. Wow, that's beautiful. That really came out nice. Guys, this is what you're aiming for. You know, you can hardly see the seam at all, even when the light hits it. That part really turned out nice. And like I said, it's what you're shooting for when you're doing them. Is you want this piece to look like a single piece. You want it to be, you know, you want it to be smooth and clean. And this is the fine grit. Again, just removing scratches, not trying to dig in. All right. So yeah, that's actually a beautiful example of how a seam should be filled. Like I said, you'll still see a little bit of seam here. You can see it, but you can't feel it, right? So when we prime, all that'll disappear, right? Same with this one. You can still see a little teeny bit, right? That's the one that I had done previously. You can still see a little teeny bit of the seam, but again, it's smooth, so it'll just disappear. Both of these turned out really, really nice, though. They look. You can see a little bit of seam. Actually, you know what? I can feel a little bit of seam on that one. Let me sand this one again just a bit. This is the one I did prior to filming the other day, and it doesn't feel quite as smooth as I would like. So we just hit it again really, really quickly. Again, being careful of our panel lines. And you know, honestly, I'm kind of playing with the idea of putting another square on top, just to add a little more detail, a little more interest. And you know, if I decide to do that, of course we'll show you how. Give that a quick sand, just to knock off some of the scratches. That's better. Yeah, can't feel it anymore. All right, so oh, excuse me, guys. This sand and dust gets all in your nose. Honestly, you should probably wear a mask when you're sanding, but I can't talk to you, and yeah, so yeah, that's seam lines. That's how you remove seam lines. And now once all this stuff is painted, you know, we'll be able to just pop these things back together, and yeah, so that's how it all works. So I guess I'm going to end episode 1 here. I'm going to go off and do all these other seam lines off camera. Not that I don't want to show you, but it moves a little faster when I don't have to worry with the camera. When we come back, episode 2, you know, I'm debating on what's going to be next. We will either start the priming process and get all these pieces primed, or we will start working out the lighting circuits, because there will be some additional modifications that we have to make to the parts, the feet, the legs. So let me get all these seam lines done. I'll figure out what I want to do next. It will more than likely be priming. We'll get everything primed and panel lined, or not panel lined, pre-shading. We'll do some of that, and then we'll probably work the circuits out after everything is painted. So thank you guys for tuning in and watching what I do and listen to me ramble for all this time. Look forward to seeing you guys on the next episode. Be sure to, you know, subscribe to the channel so you'll see the upcoming videos. Thanks again for watching. See you next time.